So obviously, there's a lot of stuff coming out right now about G.D. Mikovits and her credibility and her characters being assassinated, as it so typically happens with anybody that speaks up against the medical establishment as it exists. Um, they usually just have their careers destroyed. It's the same kind of dynamic that happens when anybody questions climate science or vaccine science, which is part and parcel of the same thing. Basically, when anybody goes against what the top of the power structure wants to be the narrative, they get destroyed. Now, I just happened to be reading this book by Johann Hari. I think that's how you spell it, Lost Connections. I asked for it for Christmas. And it's a pretty awesome book, but specifically, he talks about, I initially bought the book because I wanted to understand what it is that makes people depressed. So the subtitle is Uncovering the Real Causes of Depression and the Unexpected Solutions. I wanted to understand the causes of depression because I'm trying to understand what it is that gives people meaning in life. I've been trying to write about it for a little while now. I'm just a typical layman, obviously, but it's something that I'm interested in learning about, so I have been. And just as a point of interest, I've been reading about the kind of things that happen when it comes to corrupting the medical establishment for years, not because I'm anybody that does that for a living. I just do it in my spare time because I actually consider it interesting. I have two boys, and I was obviously interested in what would be the best thing for them and their health overall. I personally feel like I've always had some sort of mental anxiety, if I'm being perfectly honest, when it comes to trying to just represent myself to people, because I've never really felt like I was a part of any particular group that was around me. So, I'm trying to understand myself, and I'm trying to understand why I find it so hard to be happy. Not that I'm not happy. I'm actually a pretty affable guy, but why I've always felt kind of awkward in crowds, and it seems like other people don't. Well, obviously other people do, but I've always had a hard time connecting with people. I only have a handful of really close friends, and so I kind of wanted to understand me. This is really a journey about understanding myself, which I think most books are. This one definitely is. And he talks about his own depression and his prescription for an anti-serotonin uptake inhibitor drug. I can't remember specifically the one that he says he uses, but I did want to bring this up and talk about it because, the idea that the medical establishment is there to help you and only cares about you and is doing things like right now shutting down the entire economy, pretty much setting it up to destroy our way of life, and everything that's going to happen as a result of this, it's going to be bigger than I think most people seem to be recognizing right now. And I understand why you would want to sit around in your house and just wait for the authorities to tell you what to do. You want to be good citizens. There's nothing, I mean, that's perfectly normal. That's a perfectly normal way to react. In the face of fear, people tend to shut down and not want to hear anything unless it's from an authoritative source, and that's a perfectly reasonable way to act. We always look to experts to help us understand things that are beyond our own personal capacities and abilities. But there is a larger story. There always has been a larger story than the simplistic one that is presented on television. And the larger story in this case has to do with the overall economy. How people like, there's these memes that pop up on the internet talking about, oh, I just want a haircut, or something as simple as that. Like, to take people's lives and destroy them based on some fairly controversial projections that have not panned out whatsoever. I mean, they're not even close. And as soon as they're lifting the lockdowns, you hear from the halls of authority, oh no, it's going to get bad again. Everybody's going to die again. based on what evidence? You've been 100% wrong so far. In fact, almost everything that I read, and I perfectly understand what the effect of confirmation bias is, but I'm looking for the alternate side of the story and reading the mainstream version of the story. And I gotta tell you, the mainstream stuff is so simplistic in the way that it's presented and the way that people talk about the effects and, oh my God, we're all going to get affected, we're all going to die. First of all, that's absurd. It's obviously not happening. It's obviously not true. Look at the numbers. Look at the actual numbers. Don't read the headlines. Look at what's actually happening and try to make your understandings of this entire dynamic and everything that's going on right now, try to make them based in reality. Don't make them based on what people are telling you. Don't take what people say to you at face value. Okay? People can and do have ulterior motives. And so I think I've rambled enough. I just wanted to read to you from this book because I thought it was really something. He's talking about now how we came to be in this paradigm where we believe that pharmaceutical drugs are the answer to a lot of the problems that happen in human, shall we say, mental. Sorry, this is my first time trying to do this, and I'm not polished whatsoever or prepared, really, but I like to wing things. Human mental health is a complicated issue, but there's two ways to look at, or at least the industry has been split into two ways to look at how it happens. One is a very mechanical viewpoint of how human physiology works, saying serotonin is in short supply in the brain has been a hypothesis that has led to an entire field and hundreds of, probably billions of dollars made for pharmaceutical companies that produce drugs that try to enhance serotonin in the brain based on the theory that the only thing wrong with a chemically malfunctioning human brain is that it's lacking a proper chemical in order to stimulate positive feelings. The other way of looking at it is that maybe there's something wrong with the environment, and it's the environmental issues surrounding the patient and their everyday life experiences that has something to do with it. Now, this is a very nature versus nurture Manichaean understanding of what it is that we as human beings are. Manichaean being black and white, left or right. Everything is this paradigm where it's either this or it's that. Why? I suppose you need to specialize where you're going to spend your money on doing research and try to understand things. And if there's nothing in it for a pharmaceutical company, why would they do research to try to produce something to bring to market that wasn't going to make them money? And if they did dump a lot of money into investing, invest a lot of money into researching drugs with the specific goal and intent of bringing them to market based on what the current science says, why wouldn't they do that? Why wouldn't it be in their best interest to try to make everything that they do and every study that they do come out in their favor? They are heavily invested in making sure that what they're doing, that what they're doing is profitable because they're doing it for the right reasons, right? Well, they're also doing it to make a profit. I think I'm okay, thanks. Sorry. So, so basically, this story is talking about how we came up with the concept of serotonin being stored in the brain as being the physical real cause of what's making people depressed. Now, this book goes in all kinds of ways. I haven't finished it yet. It's a wonderful book. I would suggest anybody read it. But I'm just going to read to you from chapter 2, called Imbalance. The year after I swallowed my first antidepressant, Tipper Gore, the wife of Vice President Al Gore, explained to the newspaper USA Today why she had recently become depressed. Quote, "It was definitely a clinical depression, one that I was going to have to have help to overcome." It's an odd turn of phrase. She said, "What I learned about it is your brain needs a certain amount of serotonin, and when you run out of that, it's like running out of gas." End quote. Tens of millions of people, including me, the author, were being told the same thing. When Irving Kirsch discovered that these serotonin-boosting drugs were not having the effects that everyone was being sold, he began, to his surprise, to ask an even more basic question. What's the evidence, he began to wonder, that depression is caused primarily by an imbalance of serotonin or any other chemical in the brain? Where did it come from? The serotonin story began, Irving learned quite by accident in a tuberculosis ward in New York City in the clammy summer of 1952, when some patients began to dance uncontrollably down a hospital corridor. A new drug named Marsalid had come along that doctors thought might help TB patients. It turned out that it didn't have much effect on TB, but the doctors noticed it did something else entirely. They could hardly miss it. It made the patients gleeful, joyful, euphoric. Some began to dance frenetically. So it wasn't long before somebody decided, perfectly logically, to give it to depressed people. And it seems to have a similar effect on them for a short time. Not long after that, other drugs came along that seemed to have similar effects, also for short periods. One named ipranoid and imiprimamine. I'm going to butcher these. So what people started to ask, could these new drugs have in common? And whatever it was, could it hold the key to unlocking depression? Nobody really knew where to look, and so for a decade, the question hung in the air, tantalizing researchers. And then in 1965, a British doctor called Alec Coppin came up with a theory. What if, he asked, all these drugs were increasing levels of serotonin in the brain? If that were true, it would suggest that depression might be caused by low levels of serotonin. Quote, "It's hard to overstate just how far out on a limb these scientists were climbing." End quote. Dr. Gary Greenberg, who has written the history of this period, explains. Quote, "They really had no idea what serotonin was doing in the brain." End quote. To be fair to the scientists who first put out the idea, he says, they put it forward tentatively as a suggestion. One of them said it was, quote, "at best a reductionist simplification," end quote, and said it couldn't have been shown to be true on the basis of data currently available. I'm not going to say the quotes. I'll try to phrase it in such a way you understand. But a few years later, in the 1970s, it was finally becoming possible to start testing these theories. It was discovered you can give people a chemical brew that lowers their serotonin levels. So if this theory was right, if low serotonin caused depression, what would happen? After taking this brew, people should become depressed. So they tried it. They gave people a drug to lower their serotonin levels and watched to see what would happen. And unless they had already been taking powerful drugs, they didn't become depressed. In fact, the vast majority of patients, it didn't affect their mood at all. I went to see one of the first scientists to study these new antidepressants in Britain, Professor David Healy, in his clinic in Bangor, a town in the north of Wales. He has written the most detailed history of antidepressants we have. When it comes to the idea that depression is caused by low serotonin, he told me, there was never any basis for it, ever. It was just marketing copy. At the time the drugs came out in the early 1990s, you couldn't have gotten any decent expert to go on the platform and say, look, there's a lowering of serotonin in the brains of people who are depressed. There was never any evidence for it. It hasn't been discredited, he says, because, quote, it never did get credited, in a sense. There wasn't ever a point in time when 50% of the field actually believed it. I'm not going to be consistent with what... I'm not a consistent guy. I'm sorry. Well, I mean, I'm trying to be. In the biggest study of serotonin's effects on humans, it found no direct relationship with depression. Professor Andrew Scull of Princeton has said, attributing depression to low serotonin is deeply misleading and unscientific. It has been useful in only one sense. When the drug companies wanted to sell antidepressants to people like me and Tipper Gore, it was a great metaphor. It's easy to grasp, and it gives you the impression that what antidepressants do is to restore you to a natural state, the kind of balance that everyone else enjoys. Sorry, my computer shut down there for a second. Irving is the fellow who started looking at this stuff, if you remember. Irving learned that once serotonin was abandoned by scientists, but certainly not by drug PR teams, as an explanation for depression and anxiety, there was a shift in scientific research. Okay, they said, if it's not low serotonin that's causing depression and anxiety, then it must be the lack of some other chemical. It was still taken for granted that these problems are caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain, and antidepressants work by correcting that chemical imbalance. If one chemical turns out not to be the psychological killer, they must start searching for another one. But Irving began to ask an awkward question. If depression and anxiety are caused by a chemical imbalance and antidepressants work by fixing that imbalance, then you have to account for something odd that he kept finding. Antidepressant drugs that increase serotonin in the brain have the same modest effect in clinical trials as drugs that reduce serotonin in the brain. And they have the same effect as drugs that increase another chemical, norepinephrine. Norepinephrine? Give me a few minutes, I'll try to have that one. And they have the same effect as drugs that increase another chemical, dopamine. In other words, no matter what chemical you tinker with, you get the same outcome. So Irving asked, what do people taking these different drugs actually have in common? Only he found one thing, the belief that drugs work. It works, Irving believes, largely for the same reason that John Haygarth's wand worked. He went into that earlier in the chapter. Another chapter. Because you believe you are being looked after and offered a solution. Power of the mind apparently is pretty incredible. Which is why I've been saying since the start of this thing, if you lock down everyone and you make them panic and you give them anxiety by telling them there's this thing coming for them that you can't see and it could be anywhere, lurking under any pillow, you're scaring people. You're creating an immune response in people that will have negative effects. You're giving people heart attacks. You're giving people anxiety, panic. All these things lead to people not knowing what to do, especially people that don't really understand much about the way the human system works and just generally are good people that try to believe what they're told by authorities. And what do? They panic. They panic. They start isolating themselves. They don't get the exercise they need. They don't give the positive thinking that they need. They don't get the sunlight that they need. And they start disinfecting everything. We live in a world where we're made up of all kinds of living creatures that feast on chemicals that either improve or, I don't want to say the word, they either improve or deplete our immune function. And basically, everything we're doing is depleting the immune function of the people who are the most vulnerable. And so you see an uptick in people. By the way, they're stepping into chaotic situations if they go to the hospital. And then they're being mistreated. I mean, the fact that they're intubating all these people based on a protocol that seems obviously to be killing more people than it's helping, I mean, that's a clusterfuck of problems that, why don't they ever talk about that on the news? They may address it in part, but they're never really saying what's really going on, which is we're killing people with the way that we're treating them. It's not a novel disease that's killing people. It's the novel panic surrounding the way that we're treating something that we believe to be true. And it's making people sick. Just the idea of it is making people sick. Depression makes people sick. That's what this book is about. How do you fix people that are sick? How do you help people that are depressed? You don't make them more depressed. You don't freak them out. Sorry. After 20 years of researching this at the highest level, Irving has come to believe that the notion depression is caused by a chemical imbalance is an accident of history, produced by scientists initially misreading what they were seeing, and then drug companies selling that misperception to the world to cash in. They're just trying to help you, folks. They're just trying to help you. And I believe some of them are, by the way. I think that good people work at drug companies and are, you know, for the most part, by and large, people do things that they think are for the right reasons. Okay? Most people are good people. We do have financial incentives too. You have to weigh that as part of that giant structure that operates in society. That I'm not making this a case against capitalism. I don't even want to start talking about capitalism, but people, by and large, do the right things for the right reasons. I am not condemning people. I am condemning a structure with benefits baked into the cake that pervert what the science studies and produces. And if you think more control over that top-down structure, by the way, I started reading this in the first place because of Mikovits, because I see simplistic thinking on Facebook. The only real social portal I use is Facebook, which is hilarious, but it's the only one I use. And friends, good, well-meaning friends, people who I really admire and think want to do the right things. Sorry. Okay, sure. Yes, please. That would be lovely. Thank you. People are trying to understand what's happening right now, but they are absolutely given the wrong information by a power structure that's trying to protect its own influence. And, you know, we have a meritocracy-based society, and somehow, as human beings, we look to people in positions of authority because in a time of crisis, as I mentioned before, that's just what you do. But if the incentives that they have been working under for years are perverse, or maybe even really corrupt, just by the way that things have to be done in order to, again, and not an attack on capitalism, but just because of the way things need to be done, because it needs to be financially viable to produce drugs to give to people, and you need to have this faith in a system. Otherwise, you might have people doing things that are ridiculous, like, I don't know, drinking aquarium cleaner to try to heal themselves. People can do stupid stuff. Like, I'm not discounting that. But one of the stupidest things that people do is they don't take care of themselves. They don't eat healthy food. I am personally guilty of drinking too much. I know that. It's been something I've been struggling with, just to be perfectly honest with you. And I've been reading books and trying to understand that about myself and my own problems that I've been trying to overcome. But that's another story. I'm talking about the fact that I am a regular person, and regular people look to people in positions of authority to tell us the right thing to do in times of crisis. And what we're being told does not make sense on any level. I mean, it's just the singular argument is protect human lives. Obviously, look, you think I care about this because I don't care about human lives, or I don't care about the elderly or the immunocompromised or people that are more likely to get taken out by whatever is going on right now, which, by the way, has not really been identified that well. It looks like a bunch of Chinese propaganda. No, I don't hate Chinese people. No, I'm not a racist, okay? What I'm talking about is the Chinese government has an agenda. Okay, I'm not talking about whether or not this originated in a lab, because I'm not even sure what it is we're talking about here. The only thing that originated out of China was the panic that spread like wildfire to the Western world. And maybe there was a new sickness, but there's always new sicknesses, and they always travel the world, and they always take out the same segment of society because they're vulnerable because of lifetime choices that they made. Or maybe they're just old, and they go to a home, and they get the wrong kind of care, and that wrong kind of care makes them more frail and vulnerable every single year. What are we doing? Why are we not treating life with respect? Some people would... Okay, I'm rambling. Listen, they eat crappy food. They have crappy health care. They get wheeled around. They get taken in and out of bed. There's hands on them all the time. Of course, if there was a respiratory illness, it's going to get into old folks, especially long-term care homes, and it's going to kill people because those people need the most amount of hands actually touching them and moving them around and helping them to do everything. And I'm not discounting the value of their lives. The value of their lives, especially to their family members, is something that you cannot put a price on. But what else could have been done? How else could we have done this? Could we maybe have found a way? It's my belief that what needs to be happening is centralized control needs to be dissipated. We need to start looking at small scale family farms, holistic farming, where you have this cyclical use of livestock and crops, and you move everything around. It helps the microbiome in the soil. That stuff's really important. That's stuff we should be talking about. Read The Vegetarian Myth by Lierre Keith. That's all I want to say. Okay, really, what we're doing, this factory farming, this monocropping, that's what's destroying a lot of what is good in this world, and it's a totally top-down power structure. And the people at the top know that the food that they're producing is not healthy. We've seen so much talk about glyphosate and the problems that it has and associated with the human health, human health in general. I mean, glyphosate is a bad thing. Okay, it can be helpful to kill some weeds. I've seen arguments for why it can be good, but are we really taking enough of it out of the food that we eat? I think most of us get processed, crappy food that is devoid of nutrients because, again, that goes back to the microbiome, the topsoil. And the food that we're feeding our livestock is also depleted. So we take depleted food, we feed it to our livestock, we eat the livestock that is not getting what it needs in order to be healthy, and we have these horrible factory farming processes. I don't like factory farming. I think it's horrible. I think it should be banned, okay? I think that the power should be taken away from these giant companies that do factory farming. I'm not talking about processing of meat. I also know that if we don't have enough meat, then the calories that don't go out to the people that need that cheap food supply, the effects of not having that is going to be more detrimental than how can I say this? You need to have a food supply that is good and healthy for the people, but having some food is better than having no food. Okay, even if you have crappy, unhealthy, poison-laced food, it's better than not eating. Starving is quite an immediate consequence. What I'm saying is we need to build to a better future where we have large farms, but operated on the correct principles that bring life and rejuvenation back into the process. There are people that know how to do this. They've been talking about it. I'm just trying to think of a documentary. Food Inc. All I can say is go watch Food Inc. Food Inc. discusses the problem brilliantly, okay? I don't like factory farming. I'm not anti-meat. I think that, I'm getting way off the trail. Okay. Okay, so where was I? And so Irving says the primary explanation for depression offered in our culture starts to fall apart. The idea you feel terrible because of a chemical imbalance was built on a series of mistakes and errors. It has come as close to being proved wrong, he told me, as you ever get in science. It's lying broken on the floor like a neurochemical Humpty Dumpty with a very sad smile. Colorful. I had traveled a long way with Irving on his journey, but I stopped there startled. Could this really be true? I'm trained in the social sciences, which is the kind of evidence I'll be discussing in the rest of this book. I'm not trained in the kind of science he is a specialist in. I wondered if I was misunderstanding him, or if he was a scientific outlier. So I read all that I could, and I got as many other scientists to explain it to me as possible. Sorry, running out of steam here. Up too late, stress, drinking. explain it to me. So I got as many other scientists to explain it to me as possible. Quote, there's no evidence that there's a chemical imbalance in depressed or anxious people's brains. Professor Johann Moncrief, one of the leading experts on this question, explained to me bluntly in her office at the University College of London. The term doesn't make any sense, she said. We don't know what a chemically balanced brain would look like. People are told that drugs like antidepressants can restore a natural balance to your brain, she said, but it's not true. They create an artificial state. The whole idea of mental distress being caused simply by a chemical imbalance is, quote, a myth, she has come to believe, sold to us by the drug companies, those ever-loving drug companies that only ever want to protect you and take you home and hold you and give you warm feelings, and here's some drugs also. Listen, they love you, folks. The clinical psychologist, Dr. Lucy Johnstone, was more blunt still. Quote, almost everything you were told was bullshit, she said to me over coffee. The serotonin theory, quote, is a lie. I don't think we should dress it up and say, oh, well, maybe there's evidence to support that. There isn't. Okay. I'm just going to read a couple more pages, and then I wanted to just read you a small excerpt from another chapter, and then I'll be done rambling. Yet it seemed wildly implausible to me that something so huge, one of the most popular drugs in the world, taken by so many people all around me, could be so wrong. Obviously, there are protections against this happening, huge hurdles of scientific testing that have to take place before a drug gets to our bathroom cabinets. I felt as if I had just landed in a flight from JFK to LAX, only to be told that the plane had been flown by a monkey the whole way. Surely there are procedures in place to stop something like this from happening. How could these drugs have gotten through the procedures in place if they were really limited, as this deeper research suggested? I discussed this with one of the leading scientists in the field, Professor John Ioannidis. By the way, he's one of the guys that's talking out right now about what we're doing in handling this crisis. And he's pointing out the inconsistencies in the science. He's pointing out that basically it's the same general population that dies every year from seasonal flus. And what we're doing is going to lead to massive, massive blowback. And he's being attacked for it. But he was pretty important back when this book was written. That was before he spoke against the leading with them. But I discussed this with one of the leading scientists in the field, Professor John Ioannidis, who the Atlantic Monthly has said may be one of the most influential scientists alive. He says it is not surprising that the drug companies could simply override the evidence and get the drugs to market anyway, because, in fact, it happens all the time. He talked me through how these antidepressants got from the development stage to my mouth. It works like this. The companies are often running their own trials on their own products, he said. That means they set up the clinical trial, and they get to decide who gets to see any results. So, quote, they are judging their own products. They're involving all these poor researchers who have no other source of funding and who have little control over how the results will be written up and presented, end quote. Once the scientific evidence is gathered, it's not even the scientists who will write it up much of the time. Typically, it's the company people who write up the published scientific reports. This evidence then goes to the regulators, whose job it is to decide whether or not to allow the drug into the market. But in the United States, 40% of the regulators' wages are paid by the drug companies, while in Britain, it's 100%. When a society is trying to figure out which drug is safe to put on the market, there are meant to be two teams: the drug company making the case for it, and a referee working for us, the public, figuring out if it properly works. But Professor Ioannidis was telling me that in this match, the referee is paid by the drug company team, and that team almost always wins. So there's the drug company, and then there's the people that are supposed to be making sure that the drug company is being honest and upfront and telling us something that works, actually works, and they're paid by the drug company. The rules they have written are designed to make it extraordinarily easy to get a drug approved. All you have to do is produce 2 trials, anytime, anywhere in the world, that suggests some positive effect of the drug. If there are 2 and there is some effect, that's enough. So you could have a situation in which there are 1,000 scientific trials and 998 find the drug doesn't work at all, and 2, find there is a tiny effect, and that means the drug will be making its way to your local pharmacy. Quote, I think that this is a field that is seriously sick, Professor Ioannidis told me. The field is just sick and bought and corrupted, and I can't describe it otherwise. I asked him how it made him feel to have learned all this. It's depressing, he said. That's ironic, I replied. But it's not depressing, he responded, to the severe extent that I would take SSRIs. Ha ha ha! I tried to laugh, but it caught in my throat. Okay. So basically, what we're hearing is that these drugs are produced by companies who produce the trials, as many as they need to get something to market, because they can see, basically, if you're a drug company and you go, hey, we're going to create this drug, and if this drug works, here's our projections of how much we're going to make in sales if we really push it and we, take this much advertising and we get it out, we distribute it to all these different people. Here's how much money we are projected to make. And they take that amount of money that they're projected to make, and they weigh it against how much it's going to cost to keep doing the clinical trials they need to do. This is only the big companies, by the way. Smaller companies don't have the luxury of doing this, but big companies do this shit, okay? They basically say, here's how much money we can make based on, models of things that have happened in the past, not unlike modeling epidemics or pandemics. And they say, well, how much are we prepared to spend on it, both in the research stage and bringing it to market and all of the things? What's our return on investment? Okay, how much are we willing to throw at this thing? And at what point do they get so deeply into something that they actually can't extract themselves from it? It sounds like if you're doing 1,000 trials and only 2 of them are good, and you're still going to bring that thing to market, which they do, because they also weigh the cost of what it's going to cost to pay off lawsuits to people if they see some negative effects or like physical effects caused by the antidepressants or the things that they're saying that are going to help people. If they see that there's going to be this small percentage of people that have this side effect that's going to probably cause problems, and we may see some lawsuits, how much is that contingency going to cost us? They think about all that shit. They do, okay? They do. That's just the nature of it. That's what happens when companies get so big they don't actually have to produce a decent product. It's called regulatory capture. What they do, instead of making decent products, is they corrupt the government, okay? They pay the government. There are more pharmaceutical lobbyists in the government than any other lobbyists. Why is that? Return on investment. How much can they make? That's not capitalism, folks. It's crony capitalism. Regulatory capture. Look it up. So, I just want to read this because I think people need to understand something about these drugs. You tell people they're going to work, and they do. It's the placebo effect, okay? What you don't do, like I said, is part of that number crunching they do where they look at the contingency of possible blowback. Well, first of all, they're going to deny that their drug, they're gonna tell you that, hey, by the way, you knew that this thing might cause these problems. They do it every time you see those commercials on TV for a pharmaceutical company, and it talks about, by the way, here's all the things that could happen to you. You could grow a third eye. You might lose one of your legs. You might die from cancer. All that kind of stuff is like in there, and the tagline is like a second thought. But really, what we're talking about is if all those byproducts of using drugs to cure us from something that they don't even do are brought to market because of the placebo effect, and that's the reasoning to say that it's good to give people this stuff anyways. By the way, there is a doctor in this book that makes that case. Giving people something is better than nothing. But what is the blowback? Not unlike when we shut down the entire economy to prevent something that is, I mean, every bit of evidence shows to it that it's a seasonal illness. There's nothing outside of the normal happening here. The numbers aren't even really high. They might be a slight bump, a slight statistical bump that will flatten the curve itself when that pool of the most vulnerable has already been culled. Okay, that's what's going to happen. That's what we already see happening. That's why it happens, because they're predisposed to death. They're not healthy people. And when they get exposed to something, They die. It happens every year. I'm not trying to be callous about this. I'm not trying to be morbid. I'm just trying to be accurate. Because if you're not accurate, you can have some wild speculation that leads to things like shutting down the economy and not discussing the blowback because you think the placebo effect, the idea that what you're doing is good for society because it makes people feel better when you created the panic and the market for it in the first place. That's not right. That's not right. There's going to be blowback. Why are people in government not discussing what's happening here? Some people are, by the way. They're silenced. They're put down. People attack them ad hominem style. They destroy them. It's been going on for a long time. Some people said to Irving, so what? Okay, so say it's a placebo effect. Whatever the reason, people still feel better. Why break this spell? He explained, the evidence from the clinical trials suggests that the antidepressant effects are largely a placebo. But the side effects are mostly the result of the chemicals themselves, and they can be very severe. Of course, Irving says, there's weight gain. I massively ballooned. Sorry, the author's talking about himself now when he started taking the SSRIs. And saw the weight fall off almost as soon as I stopped. We know that SSRIs, and the new type of antidepressants in particular, contribute to sexual dysfunction, and the rates for most SSRIs are around 75% of treatment-engendered sexual dysfunction. He continued, though it's painful to talk about, this rang true for me too. In the years I was taking Paxil, so that's what he was taking, I found my genitals were a lot less sensitive, and it took me a really long time to ejaculate. This made sex painful, and it reduced the pleasure I took from it. It was only when I stopped taking the drug that I realized having more pleasurable sex again. That I started having more pleasurable sex again, and that I remembered regular sex is one of the best natural antidepressants in the world. Just saying. Quote, in young people, these chemical antidepressants increase the risk of suicide. There's a new Swedish study showing that it increases the risk of violent criminal behavior, Irving continued. In older people, it increases the risk of death from all causes. It increases the risk of stroke. In everybody, it increases the risk of type 2 diabetes. In pregnant women, it increases the risk of miscarriage and of having children born with autism or physical deformities. So all of these things are known. And if you start experiencing these effects, it can be hard to stop. About 20% of people experience serious withdrawal symptoms. So he says, if you want to use something to get its placebo effect, at least use something that's safe. We could be having people, we could be giving people the herb St. John's wort, Irving says, and we'd all have the positive placebo effects and none of these drawbacks. Excuse me, again, I'm running out of steam here. Although, of course, St. John's wort isn't patented by the drug company, so nobody would be making much profit off it. By this time, Irving was starting, he told me softly, to feel guilty for having pushed those pills for all those years. Okay, I'm going to skip reading that part here, and I just wanted to read this one more thing to you because I'm rambling, and who watches a video for an hour anyway, besides me? So now they're talking that this is where they're doing another study, and they're talking about how much social connections matter and having positive relationships with other people matters. By the way, what are we doing right now? We're keeping people apart. We're physically distancing them and socially distancing them. We're telling people they need to not be in the same room as other people. We're not letting, never mind, we're not letting the microbes and the normal biology of human function happen, which does when we touch each other and hug and kiss on the cheek and shake hands. All that stuff lets microbes talk to each other and actually, it makes our immune function better. And we're constantly scrubbing our hands with antiviral chemicals that they're not helping our immune system, folks. I mean, there's books about the fact that if we don't recognize ourselves, I'm not saying don't ever wash your hands. I'm not saying don't ever have a shower. What I'm saying is when you obsessively kill the healthy bacteria that's on your skin, you're not doing yourself any favors. There's books about it. I contain multitudes, eat dirt, read books, okay? It's not healthy. It's healthy short term. It's not healthy long term. It's creating. How many people have cracked hands, dry hands? Now you have a cracked, dry hand, and if there was a disease on your skin, it can get in through the blood. Does that make sense? People wearing these gloves. Why don't we just wear gloves all the time? Why don't we just wrap ourselves in bubble wrap and never see the outside because it's just so scary out there? What are we talking about? This doesn't make any sense. Loneliness hangs over a culture today like a thick smog. More people say they feel lonely than ever before, and I wondered if this might be related to our apparent rise in depression and anxiety. As I investigated this, I learned there are two scientists who have been studying loneliness for decades, and they've made a series of crucial breakthroughs. In the mid-1970s, a young neuroscience researcher named John Cacioppo, was listening to his professors, some of the best in the world, but there was something he just couldn't understand. When they tried to explain why human emotions change, they tried to focus when they try to explain why human emotions change, they seem to focus only on one thing: what happens inside your brain. They didn't look at what was happening in your life and ask whether that might be causing any of the changes in the brain they were discovering. It was as if they thought your brain is on an island, cut off from the rest of the world and never interacting with it. So John asked himself, what would happen if, instead of studying the brain as if it were an isolated island, we did it differently? What if we tried to study it as if it were an island that is connected by 100 bridges to the outside world, where things are being carried on and off all the time, you receive signals from the world? The way the immune system functions, by the way. When he raised these questions, his mentors were puzzled. They told him, even if it were relevant, the factors outside the brain are not fundamental to changes like depression or anxiety. And besides, they said, it's just too complex to figure out. Nobody will understand any of this for 100 years or more, they said, so we're not going to focus on it. Return on investment, folks. They're looking for immediate return on investment. That's not, again, sorry. John never forgot these questions. He puzzled over them for years, until one day in the 1990s, he finally thought of a way he might begin to study them in more detail. If you want to figure out how your brain and your feelings change when you interact with the rest of the world, you can start by looking at what happens in exactly the opposite situation. When you feel lonely and cut off from the world around you, does that experience, he asked himself, change your brain? Does it change your body? He began with the simplest study he could think of. John and his colleagues gathered 100 strangers at the University of Chicago, where he is now based, to take part in a straightforward experiment that nobody had ever tried before. If you were one of the people taking part, you were told to go out and spend a few days just living your normal everyday life, only with a few little tweaks. You had to wear a cardiovascular monitor to measure your heart rate, and you were given a little beeper and some tubes. You left the lab. On the first day of the experiment, whenever the beeper beeped, which it turned out would happen 9 times a day, you would have to stop your everyday business and write down 2 things. First, you had to note how lonely or connected you felt. Second, you had to record your heart rate from the monitor. On the second day of the experiment, you went through the same process, except this time when you heard the beeper, you'd spit into a tube, seal it, and keep it on hand to hand into the lab. John was trying to figure out exactly how stressful it is to be lonely. Nobody knew, but when you're stressed, your heartbeat goes up, and your saliva becomes flooded with a hormone called cortisol. So this experiment could finally measure how big that effect is. When John and his colleagues added up the data, they were startled. Feeling lonely, it turned out, caused your cortisol levels to absolutely soar, as much as some of the most disturbing things that can ever happen to you. Becoming acutely lonely, the experiment found, was as stressful as experiencing a physical attack. It's worth repeating. Being deeply lonely seemed to cause as much stress as being punched by a stranger. This is the last bit I'm going to read you. But I'm trying to make a point here, folks. And the point is this. Everything we're doing to stop this thing that we can't even seem to really identify that well, which everybody refers to as coronavirus or COVID-19, that's the symptoms, okay? The sickness is SARS-2. SARS-2 is the thing that we're trying to track. And they're doing a piss poor job of it. It might be a novel coronavirus, but the effects it's having, they're normal. They're normal. They're not outside of the norms. But the way that we're handling it, the fear and the anxiety and the depression we're causing, and all the things you read about where people are fighting more and they're getting more divorces, and all the things that we're doing to try to fix this problem are making it worse. And that's the point I'm trying to make right now. And it's being encouraged by pharmaceutical companies that stand to make a shitload of money. But it's a much deeper problem. I won't go into it right now. Last thing I'm going to read. John started to dig to see if any other scientist has studied the effects of loneliness. A professor named Sheldon Cohen, he learned, had carried out a study in which he took a bunch of people and recorded how many friends and healthy social connections each of them had. He then took them into a lab and deliberately exposed them, with their knowledge, to a cold virus. What he wanted to know was, would the isolated people get sicker than the connected people? It turned out that they were 3 times more likely to catch the cold than people who had lots of close connections to other people. We're making people sicker with what we're doing, folks. Doesn't make any sense. Doesn't make any sense unless you actually start taking a wider, bigger picture view of it. But this is a mistake. It's a huge mistake. The question is, I'm not that smart, and I can see it. Why can't the people in charge see it? What's going on? That's all I'm asking. I'm looking for real answers, not somebody to say, oh, that person you cited is not a real person, or they're fake, or they're making shit up because they went against the system that, more than anything, is looking to preserve itself. Does it make sense, folks?